Hi, welcome to Conversations with me, fashion historian and curator Keren Ben-Horin. My guest today is Joy Davis. She's the co host of the fashion podcast Unravel and the director of Walla Gallery in Baltimore. We talked about what made her leave New York and open a gallery from her living room. We also talked about what is missing from fashion history education today and what she's doing to change it. Hi, Joy.
Hello,
How are you today?
I'm doing good, surviving.
Good. So let's start by just introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure. So, my name is Joy Davis. I am the director at Waller Gallery. I'm also a co host on the fashion podcast, Unravel podcast. And currently, I'm actually the manager of adult and community programs at the Walters Art Museum. So, I have three roles that I undertake, and somehow they all manage to come together and connect. And I'm really happy and proud of what I get to do from day to day. And so, yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
That's incredible. You juggle a lot of different things. Um, that's really impressive. So I thought, it will be, I've known you a long time. We went to graduate school together. And I sort of like,
Person there for that, but it should be mentioned.
yeah. And so I kind of want to start with a podcast because, um, we've had conversations about this in the past, but um, you know, I feel like the podcast is sort of like a public facing aspect of your scholarship and your academic work. So, can you kind of talk a little bit about how the podcast came to be, what it means to you, what is the content?
So,
Um,
so I didn't actually start the podcast. It was started by Jasmine Chavez Helm and Dana Gooden, really good friends of mine who also went to FIT in our grad department, in our grad program. And they came to me individually to do this project. I think they knew that I was like excited to talk about the themes they wanted to and to try to figure out how to democratize um, democratize our scholarship from grad school so that more people can know what we do, how we do it, and have fun with it. So I wasn't in a place to do that when they both approached me. So I connected them together, and so they started it. So I was really happy I could come on about a year in, and I've been with them ever since, and it's been awesome. And we've really shifted about. We've been around for 5 years. We've really, oh, there we are. We really what is the best, we've really evolved over the last, I want to say, 4 years, because when I came on, I pushed us, and really it was with the buy-in from Dana and Jasmine that we really shifted to talking about more marginalized groups and marginalized histories, not just BIPOC or Black Indigenous people of color, but also the Jewish community, also other narratives around gender as it pertains to fashion. So, because a lot of these narratives don't always get brought up, for those that are familiar with your show, I'm sure know that you do speak to the Jewish experience and the Israeli experience, but that's not very common overall. Like, we don't really learn a lot about that when we're going through scholarship. So we really wanted to kind of like highlight those stories. And so, yeah, it's been running for 5 years. We also do Unravel Weeklies on Tuesdays and Thursdays over at Instagram. And so we're just so happy to have our fashion nerds, our like hive, and colleagues like you who we could really like talk to consistently and keep the conversation going over the years. It's been great.
One of the things that I realized after graduating, after I already had a master's degree, that there are a lot of different narratives that are not usually taught as part of fashion history. And it really made me think, why in a program where we study the history of fashion, we don't even devote, never mind a semester, not even a class, to talking about the cotton trade. That is a very, very important important narrative of fashion history, of labor. And it kind of made me stop thinking about fashion only in terms of craft,
Mm.
and start thinking about fashion in a much sort of like broader way, more as an academic technique rather than a field. And I think one of the things that I really love about your show is exactly that it kind of like, because it surfaces a lot of those stories that helps us see fashion in a different context.
Yeah, and that's definitely on purpose. And it was something, in my last semester, I have to say, not even throughout my time at FIT, which was a 2-year program. This is a great example. Like, I started to think about Spanish culture and subcultures because I noticed that even Spain isn't really, even though it's part of the European fashion system, it's not really seen as like a fashion capital or a center of fashion, even though it had its own kind of fashion culture and subcultures that were really interesting. And also, they were a big part of colonialism to what we now consider to be North and South America. And so it was really important for me to kind of dig into that and to start digging into that in my last 2 semesters at FIT. But I wanted to go back to the thing you said about really important point about why we don't talk about these things. And I think it's because we center everything involving the fashion system around the French fashion system, which isn't necessarily accurate to how fashion works. It's just very specific to Western fashion cultures at a certain time period going into the 21st century. So I realized that was like a awakening for me. And going back to that thing, that kind of point about fashion is a culture, it's fashion culture, it's not just technique. And in our program, but also in many others, it's seen that way, right? It's seen as a art form. There's like that huge debate that I think has been dispelled now. But when I was still in grad school, it was still kind of a debate around whether fashion was art or not. And obviously we've dispelled all of that, hopefully. But I feel like, what I want to say, the industry or our colleagues were kind of like in the midst of that conversation. And now I feel like I don't think we're over it, but now that we've kind of gone over that hurdle, we can really dig into some more solid and substantial conversations around fashion cultures and move beyond like the Western lens of what fashion is. And this is another example of Goyesco costume and Majismo costume in Spain. The Goyesco and Goyescas were a subculture in Spain. And you can kind of see what is the best way to describe them? They were a subculture. They kind of influenced rioting and uprisings within Spain. It really incited a fervor amongst what was considered sort of like the merchant and middle class. See my dog back here. It's a really rich, as you can see, it's a very rich history. So it's
very interesting. What is that jacket in the center made of? Is it woven? Is it knitted?
So it's woven at its base, but then it has a bunch of accessory structures. So I couldn't find a really great image of it, but it has a lot of like golden embroidery. It's probably one of the more magnificent versions of this particular style of jacket that's online for us to see. I've heard of others and it being very common. And, within this subculture, that it was taken on by the bourgeois, it was taken on by, if you want to say the court, if you will, of the time, and like rich, the aristocracy. So like it started to shape into something that's very different. It's like we were just talking about on a particular episode, we were talking about the Lacroix sweatshirt that was worn on Vogue. And so it was like kind of taking this subculture and manufacturing it for the elite. And so you'll start to kind of see that through this process. And this happens a lot in fashion, the bottom up dressing, as it's called. I think that was coined by Lourdes in our program. But you see it over and over and over again. It kind of gets recycled backwards, upward and over.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, we think of it as like a contemporary occurrence or phenomenon, but it actually goes way, way back even to sort of like 17th century and 18th century.
Exactly. And you see, and like I said, it happens over and over and over again. Another great point that you made about, you know, moving beyond, so learning about the Goyescos and the Goyescas. I then moved to thinking about colonial art, and I didn't really know it at the time, but when I was interning as a conservation intern at the Hispanic Society of America, I was trying to decide at that same time what my thesis paper was going to be for graduation. And I was deciding between a jazz era painter and also Costas. Very different. I just wanted to do something really weird, but I was yearning for what you were talking about, and that is conversations about fashion culture that I was not seeing in our curriculum. Like, these are just two subjects that just were not really discussed in any way. And I landed on Costas. They have two paintings that were done by painters at that collection, in their collection. This is located in New York, in Harlem, the Hispanic Society of America, that were done, two paintings and portraits that were done by Costa painters. They don't have Costas there, but it just like sent me into like this whole new world of colonial Spanish art. And I had sort of heard about it and known that there was an art culture at the time of colonialism in Central and South America, but like to really dig into it at this point in my career and like knowing how to research, which was really an important skill, I started to dig into Costas. And Miguel Cabrera is one of them, as we're seeing here. And it really showed me how race was perceived in South and Central America and how that is so relational. Even though the timeline is very different, it's not parallel, but how very relational it is to existence of being a Black and brown person in what we now know as the United States. So it really took
that a little bit. Can you explain that relationship?
Sure. So without getting into like really specific dates, colonial Spain, when there's supposed to be Atlantic slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, slaves were brought to South America first. As a result, because there was strain from Spain, there was a kind of pulling apart, especially at the time. It started to happen around the time Costas were very popular or gained their height of popularity. So like end of 18th century, all throughout the 19th century. And so there started to be a lot of tension. And therefore, while we were still dealing with chattel slavery and slavery in what is now the US, they had already abolished slavery in South America officially, because there's, one of the reasons Juneteenth is important is because it kind of like is this like pivotal moment in history when it's officially abolished. The last slave is abolished, or the last slave in slavery is abolished in the U.S. So that it kind of has an overlap, but they're not necessarily parallel. Mm-hmm. And how Spain and colonial Spaniards dealt with race is very different than how it was dealt in the U.S., but there are a lot of relationships. So one of them is through miscegenation, which was we want to breed the otherness out of you, which is like super problematic, super violent. I don't think that I think it's unacceptable. And it really led to a lot of controversy what should I say? It led to a lot of generational trauma when it comes to race, colorism, and identity. And so these paintings were kind of illuminating that for a global, I'll say global, but really for a elite and Spanish audience for the majority. These Costas consisted, and this is also another Costa painter called Francisco Clapera, who I focused on in my thesis at school. These paintings in particular were broken up into 16 parts, and they showed multiple racial mixing and what their children would look like in these 16 parts. Colonial art is separating itself from the rest of kind of what is seen in South America and what is seen before revolution and after revolution, which is another kind of marker in South American art. And I'm generalizing here because it changes. So in Brazil, it's a little bit different. In Mexico, which is where Copera was working, it's a little bit different. And how miscegenation worked throughout these different countries, what are now countries, was very different in how it worked. And so I don't want to get into the minutia, but it did come out in dress. And as you can see, from this like first tier down to, I think we're at number 12. Yeah, 12. So we're looking at one that is numbered at number 1 and one at 12, and you can kind of see the difference in how race is perceived through dress, but also through station in life and race, of course, and just their general perception. And one of the reasons I use this juxtaposition, I think twice now in presentations, because they're both outside, they're both partaking in the market, but it's in a very different way in how they function. And the kids, you can kind of see a lot in how the kids are dressed and how they're treated. Obviously in the one to the right in the photo of the object in the right, the kid is working. Like it's very different. That just kind of like the energy is very different. The one on the right, there's more tattered clothing, there's a working class feeling or poverty feel to, even though it's very beautiful and they're outside and it seems very serene, there's very, what do I want to say? Very forceful visual elements that tell us that these folks are different and they should be treated differently. And also, just as an added layer, this is what their children look like. So we can also judge their children, which again, this is another parallel to North American slavery, I should say, and racism, is it works very differently. And one of the reasons for this, and the reason why they're so obsessed with this, because this was a very popular art form, is because of miscegenation. They were extremely paranoid about people's station in life, people's ability to move up or down on the social ladder. And so you see a lot of variance in costume paintings throughout the century, throughout the late 18th century. And by the time of revolution, it's I wouldn't say they're abolished, but they definitely are in poor taste at that point. This is a photo I like to use. It's also from the Denver Art Museum. It just shows kind of like different, it doesn't kind of show. It shows people in different stations of life and what they look like and how they're perceived together and how acceptable this might have been. And how you might have some working class, merchant class folks, higher folks, people that work in the church or work clerical work, which was kind of like a higher station, and then the musicians, and of course the dog. It's just, they also, you know, this is a medium for studying fashion that was very new to me when I saw it, and I realized like this is a whole new medium that I could be looking at to analyze fashion.
Right.
So through our training, I like kind of learned that there's just so many, it's not just painting or photography, there's so many other mediums to kind of tease out what was happening in fashion.
Right, and I think you bring a really good point, sort of like about how what do we use to write fashion history, and how as fashion historians, we really have this kind of like advantage. We can use a lot of different mediums, a lot of different types of objects, and we can kind of bring together cultural history, social history, gender history, economic history. Through this kind of lens of fashion, we can tell a very complex story of how
necessary, right? Like you have to. We can't really, and that's not to say other focuses in history don't do it as well, but because it's still seen as a new subject of study, there's so much we have to pull in to make it make sense for the audience, right? We can't just say this is this type of dress and this type of bustle, or this particular person is wearing ruffles and that means this, or they're wearing chicadores, so that means a certain thing. because people don't have reference for those, not the language, or, and I mean, that's everything from publishers to our audience on the podcast. Like, it really isn't common knowledge. So it requires what you're talking about to, put forth a narrative that we want to.
Right, and then it's really helpful to have a medium like a podcast to sort of like translate that into something that's more approachable. And I think for me, one of the things that are really attracts me in thinking about fashion and using fashion is something that anyone can do. It's really a tool that we each have to express ourselves, to study ourselves, to study our history. And so I think like making it approachable, we can sort of like show people, okay, you have this, you can kind of really research your history, your own private history through thinking about dress in your family, textiles in your family, and how we even like why we dress in a certain way now and we did differently in the past. So I think all of those things are really come through in your research in a very kind of interesting way.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I learned from the best, Keren. My studies, while I did go to grad school, I learned very quickly, even in thinking about what my assignments were, I learned very quickly that if I wanted to get out of it what I wanted, I had to kind of work outside the bounds of what was being required in the class. So like, I really was interested in how I was going to get a job. And so while this isn't really related to what we're talking about today, it is in the sense that like I had to have, and then I kind of had to manifest this. I had to find drive to push myself around kind of the barriers of thinking that were created in our program. And I think that happens in a certain way with other programs because they don't have the technical skill. Like, it's not like a driving force of the program. Mm-hmm. So if they wanted to do that, they have to kind of like hustle to kind of work around the bounds of their program. So it really taught me that in more ways than one, through my scholarship, through trying to get a job. Just, I just wanted to mention that because it's a huge driving force as to why I'm even on a podcast, like why I thought about doing Costas when I really didn't have any foundation to work on colonial Spain. I just had to kind of like learn colonial Spanish history, like almost overnight. Like it took a few months, but it was like, a crash course.
One of the things that that is problematic in the museum world is that it's close to a lot of people, and it's very exclusive in various different ways. So that kind of like, it makes me think about the gallery as sort of like you going off and creating that space for yourself. So do you want to kind of talk about that?
Yeah, so without having that drive, that initial drive that I'm talking about, I wouldn't have gotten to the podcast. That wouldn't have gotten me here. So it required baby steps, and it required a sense of experimentation, even if it was just a touch of that, to know what I could do and like what my capability was. And that's how I operate. Some people just like jump off the ledge and they're like good to go. That's not really how I operate. I don't feel comfortable doing that. But yeah, the gallery. So this was kind of like me cautiously like just taking a dive into the deep end, as it were. So I left New York after 2 years of, I was in New York for about 5 years, but I left New York after 2 years of doing research around doing a gallery. And first I thought I would do something in New York. I'm based in New York now. Like, I have a small group of folks that could be supportive, and I'm working. I was currently, working in New York. So it made the most sense. But then I like looked and saw like what I would really need to do to set it up. And this idea wasn't my own. It came from my mom. But I kind of took the ball and ran with it. And so I realized like returning, me and my boyfriend wanted to return to Baltimore City, where I spent most of my time. And yeah. And so it was a difficult choice, but we just had a lot to research. We had to think about like, what did I want? And like, why? Like, what is the why of like doing the gallery? And one of the way I answered the why question was talking to artists, both at the graduate level, at the undergraduate level, and asking them like what they were getting out of their experience. And a lot of them said they just didn't have enough support. Institutions weren't providing enough space for them. And so I was like, bet, I can't necessarily go into a particular college and do and change all of that, but I can provide space. I can help you build a resume. I can work on the space so that we can provide stipends, which as of now we are able to do, is provide micro grants for each artist that we work with. And so that's when we started Waller. And we did a lot of research. The reason it took 2 years is because we were kind of talking through with the artists what their needs might be, and just any artist, not necessarily artists we wanted to work with. And then we had to decide on like what kind of building it was going to be in. And one of the parameters was that we had to also live in it, because there was no way I was going to afford 2 rents or afford 2 mortgages. That just wasn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. So that took about 2 years, a year and a half. And so 2 years ago, we're going into our 3rd year, we opened in April.
And so that's part of your essentially private space, which is also now public space.
Exactly. Yeah, it's public. It is very distinctly public. I think this particular photo is taken, it looks a little bit different now, but I really like these shots of our first exhibition because I'm proud of the work that we did with that, being that it was our first show. And it looks a lot less like a living room and that it's a part of a house than it did when we opened, for sure. There's been a lot of changes.
So what kind of art do you show in your gallery?
We show all art. Like it says on the slide, multidisciplinary art. We focus on artists of color, primarily Black artists living in the city or working in the city of Baltimore, but we have showed folks from Puerto Rico, New York, and other locales. And the focus for us is on artists who aren't necessarily developed yet or are looking to hold space. Again, like going back to that, like what could we do to kind of fill the gaps that people are saying that they need? And it's been pretty successful. We're usually able to break even. It's just, we've just been, I would say that we have like a marginal level of success and we get a lot of press, and some of our artists have gone on to do a lot. Some of our artists have decided that, like, you know, they're pacing themselves, and we don't want to necessarily position ourselves that like we have to work artists like to the bone. Like that's not really our point. Like we just want to provide space for them and hopefully get them, you know, subsidied money if possible, if we could do that for them. Is
there any in your sort of like career up to now, is there any like a time or specific failure that kind of shaped you in any way, something that sort of like really stuck?
There's been a lot. I think there's a lot of cliches that entrepreneurs say, or really, I wouldn't say I'm really successful, but really successful entrepreneurs will say, fail hard, fail fast, or like, I failed a lot. And like, I can't say I failed a lot, but I have failed. While in grad school, I really wanted to be a conservator. That did not happen for a multitude of reasons. And it kind of put me through the ringer. Some of that experience was a little traumatizing, but it really helped me to like think about like, what do I feel the most comfortable with, and without any support, what are my skills? What can I do, and how can I grow those? And that was pivotal for me to take that loss, like eat that loss, feel that, and be in that emotion, and then turn that into basically being on a podcast, doing working in the industry. So I still went on to do fashion archiving. And that was, I felt like that was strong. And then moving on to doing the many other things that I do now. So, you know, when you have to take that loss and you kind of have to eat it and sit with it. I don't think that you should ignore it, or even if you feel like you've been wronged in the situation, to kind of like push it off. Like everything's a learning experience. That's another cliche thing that entrepreneurs say, like failures are learning experience, but it's true. You learn when you don't do things right, or you learn when you've been wronged in a situation, even if you were right? So that is a really good example, because it was more pivotal for me. Like I've failed before that and I've failed after, but that was a big trajectory, because I could just be in the basement of a museum now if I like kind of pushed through the failure, but I just didn't do that at that time. And I think it worked out a lot better.
I agree. Do you want to talk about this?
Sure. So this was a project that I did in grad school that I'm consistently thinking about. This era, and also the civil rights movement era, which we are still kind of in, honestly, um, in a sense, with Black Lives Matter. But the civil rights movement and also the Great Migration is a pivotal time for Black folks in the country and others, but especially for fashion and how Black people were dressing and visualizing, whether that be their station in life, going back to kind of how it relates to Costas and racial representation. And it kind of speaks to how people militarize their practice of being, whether that is a civil rights leader or an artist, and that really comes into the fore. So that's a long period of time. The civil rights movement, while people do think that it happened in the 50s and 60s, really started like in the 20s and the 30s at the same time as the Great Migration. So a lot of my research has shifted from Costas, which I still think about and still do episodes about and still research, to this sort of era. And I worked on, it's coming out soon, but hopefully next year. But I've been working on a lot of research around an artist and designer named Ruby Bailey. And I really want to refocus on subjects like this, because I think it's important to think about the three different ways that people inside of the civil rights movement were dressing and how they had very varying ideas about how we should move forward, either as Black people, as Americans, etc. And how they dressed kind of indicated that and dictated that. And it was an evolution. It didn't kind of stay in a certain way. It moved and it elevated and it changed. And folks within the civil rights movement, they changed. Either they were assassinated, unfortunately, or they moved out of the movement or in the movement, and it grew and it shaped different other movements as well, including the women's movement and feminism. So where am I going with all of this? Fashion really is injected into this time, and we don't really spend a whole lot of time on it. And so I just wanted to kind of speak to that and like where my research is going, and outside of the gallery space, like what I'm doing, which is this, of course, in my work at the museum. But I'm really thinking about this kind of like basically 1920s to 1970s, and how things so much shifted for African Americans in the country, and how that happened. You see it through dress. It's like undeniable.
Definitely. Well, I know that I can't wait to see what else you'll do in the future. And I really, really thank you for your time and coming on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This is amazing. And I'm so excited that this platform exists and that you're doing this. I'm so excited to be a part of it.
Thank you, Joy.